Hi there. In this tutorial I'm going to walk you through pretty much everything you need to create a scene, something like this. This is going to be one of my painting by numbers type of tutorials, so I'm going to try to cover every little detail that you need. The only thing in this image I'm not going to go into is this little person in the boat here, because I think that's just a specific to this particular version that I created here, but I'm going to go into the detail of how to create an iceberg like this, and most particularly how to set up the materials for this iceberg, because as you can see there's light passing through it as well as reflecting off it, and also how to set up the water so it looks like this. I'm going to modify it slightly because you can see there are particles of ice in the water and I don't think they were quite as I would have liked them, so I'm going to change their texture slightly as we go through. So to begin with, we need to go to the world settings here and we need to set some units up. I don't always do this, though perhaps I should more often, but in this case I wanted to make sure that I was being consistent in the scale of my objects in the scene. We need to set units. So if we go into here, I set mine to a length of metric. You can set it to the same as mine while you're copying me and then change to imperial if you wish to. And I left angles as degrees. However, I put the unit scale up to 10. So you can see the scene changed a bit there. So let's go into a second layer and we'll just add a simple plane for our water to begin with. I'm going to look from above and you can see this is currently 2 meters square. So let's scale that by 100. So that's now 200 meters, and then scale that by about 7, and we're now up to about 1.4 kilometers. And I'm going to just come down a little bit, because as I said, I'm doing this as a paint by numbers, so I'm going to keep it very close to what I had before. So 1.26 kilometers, that's what I used before. So now we'll go over to materials, we'll just say new, and we'll call this C. And to begin with, I'm just going to give this fairly basic greeny blue color, just so that I can see where it is. We'll come back to the first layer, and I'm just going to add a lamp, which is a sun lamp. Under the settings for the lamp, I'm going to set the size to 1 millimeter. So actually put mm after it for millimeters. I'll leave the bounce where it is and the cast, shadow and multiple importance at default. And I'm just going to give it a very slight blue cast, just to sort of help give that impression that we're at a pole, or somewhere cold at least. And then set the strength of this up to 6, so it's quite bright. So that's a bright sun. And obviously I'm not going to put any clouds in this scene, that's just the style I chose, so that's why I need a very small size on the sun. Now I should have said I did look at some reference images for real photographs of icebergs, and that's how I ended up with the selection of colour that I did. And most of them had no clouds in the sky either. I guess there's a lot less moisture in the air where it's very, very cold, so you tend to have less clouds. So we set up our sun, but we need to put a bit of an angle on the sun. I'm going to scale the sun up just so that we can see that little line, which helps to guide us as to where it's coming from. Rotate X 45, so it's now obviously at a slight angle there, and then I'm going to rotate it around to be about there. So I'm just looking straight down, front is here, back is here, and so on, and it's about that sort of angle. I found that was quite a good angle. And now I'll look from the front and go into orthographic view, and I think I'll make that angle a little shallower. The actual position of a sun lamp of course doesn't matter, but I'll put it about there. Just helps you to visualize where the sun's going to be coming from. So now I'm going to add another plane and look from above, and we'll just put that plane in the middle there for the moment. And it's obviously too small to see right now, I'll just put it right in the middle. So I made my plane initially roughly 400 or 500 meters per side. It's actually not completely square. It currently has dimensions of 2 by 2, so I'm going to say a scale of 200. So that gives us a plane that's about 400 meters a side. And now I'm going to just scale it up a little bit more on the y-axis, take it up to about 500 meters. And I'm just going to apply rotation and scale. I didn't do that on the previous one, so I may need to tweak some of the values from the initial settings. And then we'll just turn it around something like this. We've just got a simple plane at the moment. And there's all sorts of ways that you can do the next bit. You can use the ant landscape generator or model it directly. What I did initially was simply subdivide, and then you get these options over here. We'll add some more subdivisions, and then we'll add fractal on here just to make it a little lumpy. And then I'm going to say W and subdivide again. This time I'm going to take a few points turn on proportional editing with O and start to pull those up, and you can use the mouse wheel to increase the effect. We can also play around. For example, we can select random for the fall off type, and now we'll start to get some more variable effects. We don't actually want any points quite this sharp, but it's a starting point. And I'll select all the points again and subdivide again, and perhaps add a little bit more fractal now. And I'm going to pull up a point from in here, I think. So this isn't going to be exactly the same as the previous one I did, but I will try to do a little arch here. So we'll take this bit down, turn off proportional editing, and let's press X and remove those faces, and X and remove that face. Select that ring of vertices, and then this set of vertices, so make sure we've got a ring in both cases. Press space and type bridge, and say bridge edge loops. It's a bit rough at the moment, but that's created our joins. I'm just moving a few vertices around now, just to help it work better. And if you need to pull some apart, what we can do is press V, and that opens it up like that. And now I can just press F to fill that, and F to fill that. And again, I think I need to open that up. You may need to do it several times. I'm going to press X and delete that vertex. Can be a little tricky to see what you're doing. One of the things I find quite useful to do, turn on ambient occlusion, which starts to show up where edges are and things like that a little more easily. It's just a little bit of modelling. Perhaps I'll now dissolve that vertex. Maybe not. And then move some of these around a bit to make it work a little better. I'm just checking that we don't have any holes. Once you apply the subdivision surface, it'll get a little harder to see what's going on. Pressing dot on the keyboard helps to focus on a point that you have selected. So I'm now going to press K and just put some cuts on here, and then K again. You can press E to do multiple selections, but I like to be able to just take my time with this. So this is the knife tool. Be a little careful what you're doing, as with any knife, I suppose. So I think I'm going to join that vertex to that one now. So Alt M at last. So that was just Alt R, but it didn't go very far, but it gives me a starting point. Alt R to add, in theory, a ring of vertices or edges, which I'll be able to do in a moment once I've joined all of these edges together. So you can do your modelling however you wish. This is just a rough and ready way that I did it. GG to move a loop in or out. And then as you see, I can add a loop in the middle with Control R. And now I'm just going to sort of lift that up a little bit. Control plus and lift that up a little bit. Perhaps shrink this middle one in slightly. Maybe that one in a little bit and lift it slightly. Perhaps they all need to come in a little more. And now Control 2, and we're starting to get something interesting. We'll go to smooth shading. We will be adding more detail to this surface. I think we need to scale XX just to thicken this element up. It's looking a little flat. And then perhaps we need to turn the subdivision surface off. Select these vertices up here and then just say smooth vertex. We've got a lot of vertices joining there. It's not ideal. It really isn't a lesson in modelling. So I've used V to rip these apart. In fact, I'm going to join those two together again. Fill those. Added a new vertex in there. Join that one. And then fill that one. And now if we turn this back on, it's a little bit smoother. And this is one of the problems with triangles, of course, but it really doesn't matter that much because we're going to have quite an angular shape anyway eventually. So that's the beginnings of our iceberg, and if we bring up the second layer, we can now set the height of our iceberg relative to the water. So what I probably want is just some odd elements of it peeking through the water, perhaps something like that. And I'm going to put this up, the subdivision surface, up quite a bit. We'll go up to 3 at the moment on preview mode. Not happy with that, so I'm going to smooth that area. It's better, and although we're probably not going to see it, I'll smooth that as well. Okay, so let's have a quick look at our camera. So I had my camera set to 40mm, which just gives you a slight emphasis on the depth of the scene, and I just had to select that layer because my camera is on that layer, and I'm just going to drag it back a little bit. Now you notice my iceberg is vanishing there, and that's because of the clipping plane on the camera. So in my camera settings, it will clip at anything closer than 1 meter, but currently it will clip at anything further away than 1 kilometer. So I'm going to set that to 3 kilometers, which is what I had before, and you can see everything reappears. So let's just bring our iceberg closer to where I had it before, and then drag our camera back again. So it's a little low at the moment. If we look from the side, you can see where our camera is, and there's our plane. So let's put it somewhere like this and angle it up slightly. Perhaps off to one side a little. And we can obviously move our iceberg out slightly. I would suggest not completely centered, and certainly below the middle of the scene. You can see we've got our 3/3 of the scene. I think the iceberg can probably afford to be slightly less high to give us plenty of sky. There's quite a bit of messing around trying to work out exactly where the best place for the camera is, and that's your artistic choices. It's rotate XX to make the camera rotate on its own x-axis. I'm happy with that to begin with. Now we'll go to the world settings, and we will select a background, which is a sky texture initially. And if we have a look at that, so we're starting to get somewhere, but I decided I didn't like the exact look of the sky, so I'm going to go into the node editor, click this little world symbol, and you can see the node setup for a basic sky. So there's our world output, there's our background input. I actually darken that a little bit, so I'll set that to 0.75, and there's our sky texture. I used a turbidity of 1, but what I did do is I added a hue saturation node into here. And all I changed was put the saturation up to 4, just to give that brighter blue colour. And it shows more contrast between the blue up here and the sort of grey down here at the horizon. So that's it for the sky. Let's have a look at the sea itself now. So I've selected the sea, and we'll come into here, the object settings, and there's our basic shader that we have set up for the sea at the moment. So to begin with, I'm just going to add a mix shader. I'm going to move that diffuse over to the other side of that mix shader. So we've still got that sort of greeny colour, and I'll make this greeny colour I think a little darker and a little more intense. I'm going to add a glossy shader, set that to my preferred method, Ashgren Shirley, and put that down here. You can see we're starting to get some reflection now. And I'm going to set the roughness to 0.005. So that's pretty reflective. It's not completely flat reflection, but it is very reflective. And I think what I will also do at the moment is I'm going to rotate my camera just so that you can see the reflections a little better. So you may want something like this, but I wanted to go with a little more than that. If you like, the roughness here simulates very, very small perturbations in the surface of the sea. I think what I will also do, I will look from above, is actually rotate my seascape in the z-axis just to be roughly on the plane of the camera, so that we get the most amount of the sea that we can in the camera, and we haven't got a corner basically, so that we maintain that illusion. We could of course make the sea bigger as well, but I'm trying to keep things roughly the same so that I can just give you the direct settings. Okay, so we've got an input to add, which is a layer weight input. I'm going to set that to 0.25. Take the facing output and put it into the factor. And all that seems to have done is made the sea slightly more reflective at the moment. But of course what it's actually doing is varying the reflectivity based on the angle we're looking at it. However, the whole sea is completely flat right now, so at the moment it doesn't make much difference until we add some more nodes. So I'm going to add a texture which is a noise texture. I'm going to set that to a scale of 250, and then I'm going to duplicate it, and the copy I'm going to set to a scale of 1000. And I'm going to put the detail up to 16. You can actually type in a higher number than that if you want to. So I'm now going to add color mix node, and I'm going to set it to add. I'm going to take the factor of each one into there, and I'm going to set the mix factor on the add node to 0.636. And now I'm going to add a converter, which is a math node, set it to multiply, take the color out and put that into there. Set the value to 0.3. So this really just scales it down a little bit. And then take that into the displacement of my material. And suddenly you can see we've got small waves on the surface of the sea. You can vary this. A smaller value here makes for smaller waves. A larger value makes for larger waves. It's entirely up to you. I went with 0.3. And then this factor mixes between how much of the sort of lower frequency, in other words, larger waves we have. See, we just got the larger, smoother waves there, and how much to those we add in the higher frequency, small waves. And about 0.636 is what worked in my scene. And for the C, that's pretty much it. We can play around with things like making the diffuse darker, or we can play around with things like the layer weight. So you can see as I go to a smaller number, the whole C becomes brighter as though it's, I guess, more dissolved solids in it or something like that. Or we can go up to a higher number and it becomes more reflective. What I haven't done is used any kind of transparency. You could do that, and that will actually show you the sort of subsurface element of the iceberg. And that just depends on the particular scene you're trying to do. So now for the big one, we need to do the texture for the iceberg. So that doesn't have any material on it yet, so let's click New. I should say there is one other major thing we need to do with this iceberg, but we'll come to that in a moment. So let's first of all just put some displacement on it while it's easy to see. So I'm going to add a noise texture again. I'm going to set that to 75 and a detail of 16. I'm going to duplicate that, and this time set the scale to 250, so this is the fine detail. I'm going to add a color mix node and mix together the factor of each one. And I'm going to have it at the default of 0.5. And then this goes into the displacement. So you can see we've already got some variations in the surface there. So that's a start. Next, I need a mix shader. And I'll put that there. So I've got my diffuse on one side currently, and I'm going to put a transparent shader on the other. Now, I did play around with a number of different shaders, and this was the only configuration that really seemed to work for the effect that I did. So I'm going to build this up, and then I'll talk about how it works. So I've put the transparent shader on the other side. I'm going to just change my preview render down to just 5 samples now, just to keep the previews quick. So you can see we are already seeing partly through the iceberg. It's not looking that much like ice at the moment, however. So next I'm going to add a converter, which is a color ramp. Now with the current version of Blender, I'm on 2.78. I do find playing around with color ramps while rendering can sometimes crash Blender. Probably about 10 to 20% of the time it seems to crash it for me. However, we'll carry on. The low point I had set to 0.009. Again, this is a paint by numbers type tutorial, so I'm just giving you exactly the settings I used. The high value I had set to 0.073. So they're quite close together, and I had this set to B-spline. I'm going to add another input, which is a Fresnel input. The index of refraction I set to 1.15. Take that into there. And then take that color output into the factor on that mix shader. And you can already see it's starting to have quite an interesting effect. So at this point, we need to UV unwrap. So making sure all of the vertices are selected, I'm just going to press U and just say unwrap. You may get this error at the top, and that's because we scaled it without applying the scale, but don't worry too much about that. If you want to check that it's unwrapped, we can open the UV image editor, go into edit mode, and there you go. You can see we've got an unwrapped shape. The reason for that is because of what we're going to do next in terms of the shape of the object, and it will affect how the materials render as well. Going back into rendered view, and there we are. So it's there. It's not quite what we want yet, but it's sort of looking a bit like a painting now, which I rather like. I should say this isn't photorealistic, although possibly you could use some of these settings to get close to that. So now we need to do something about this. So let's move this diffuse over here. Grab this mix shader and copy that, drop that in there. I'm going to take a copy of this transparent shader and bring that here. And I'm going to change that to a sort of greeny blue color. And we'll put this on the other side of that mix shader. And I set that to 0.45. And you can see that's starting to give a sort of color cast to any light that's passing through the iceberg. I'm going to duplicate that mix shader again, drop that in there. I'm going to add a glossy shader, set to my preferred method, and put that on the other side. I'm going to set the roughness to 0.25. Let's just move this out the way a little bit, and I'm going to add another input, which is a layer weight input. I'm going to use the facing output and connect it into the factor on that mix shader, and I'm going to set the blend to 0.1. So we're starting to get some interesting effects down here now. You can see we're getting areas where the light bounces and where there's shadows. We're getting coloured light transmitted through, but it's still not quite there. So here's the thing which I think will make the most difference. I'm going to add another shader, which is a volume scatter node. So generally, you're either doing volumetrics or standard type of shaders. You rarely mix the two, but in this case you do. And I've done this in one other tutorial, and I found only certain combinations of surface and volume work together, and this is one of them. One of the other things to be aware of with volume scatter is if you want light to be a particular colour, you need to make the scatter colour the sort of opposite colour of that. So if I go for a sort of orange colour, that will give me a greeny blue colour for light that's passed through, if that makes sense. So I'm now going to take that output, I'm going to leave the default settings on here, I'm just going to take that output and put that into volume. And suddenly the whole thing gets a lot darker, as you can see, and it's starting to look more interesting. We still have a little bit to do in terms of the surface texture and the overall shape of the object, but we're starting to get there. As is inevitable with these things, I will need to tweak some of these settings a little bit. So you can see by going to a lower number on this mix shader, I make the ice less transparent. If I go to a higher number, we get a lot more light coming through. So I think actually, let's go for 0.55, but maybe even higher than that, 0.65. I want a little bit more light coming through these areas. We'll see how that goes. And of course we can play with these blend values. Okay, so let's come out of rendered view. That's basically the shader node. Let's have a little look at that. So starting down here, the volume scatter node in a contrasting color to the one you want transmitted through the ice goes into volume. Simple as that. So we're effectively creating scattered light within the volume of our iceberg. We've taken a couple of noise textures, one at 75 and one at 250 with 16 detail, mixed them together with a factor of 50% and put those into simple displacement. We're not using any kind of fancy displacement here, it's just to put a bit of surface texture. Next I've got another mix shader. One side of that is a transparent node set to full white, and this is what really basically makes the surface transparent, at least in places, to allow that volumetric light to show through. And that's controlled by this color ramp and this index of refraction node. So if I come down to here and go to rendered view and tweak this index of refraction, you can see we're going to a higher number and we're getting a more, almost looks like foam that this is made of now, because so much light is coming through it that's volumetric light, which may be something you want to do. But for my scene, I'm looking more to get to a hard surface that just has a translucence to it. And I did try the translucent shader, but wasn't too happy with it. And you can see there, we've got very little. I think we're going to go with 1.1 for the moment. And it's all controlling really how transparent that surface is. So then we have the area that controls a lot of the color and so on. So we have a mix shader that is mixing between the output of this mix shader and glossy. So this gives you some glossiness to the surface, quite a rough surface at 0.25. I'm using the Ashman-Shirley method, and that's being mixed with the output of this mix shader, which is mixing between simple diffuse, and we can perhaps brighten that up a little bit closer to full white, and a transparent shader with a colour on it. And I just use something about there. And you can play around with these colours to get the look that you want. So someone asked me to make sure you get a view of the full node setup. I'll try to do that. Just move these in a little bit so that I can show it to you at a reasonable size. So hopefully you can see that. And that's my ice shader, or at least it is at the moment. So let's move that up out of the way, come out of rendered mode. One last thing we need to do to this iceberg, and that's to give it some more surface detail. So I'm going to come over to here under the modifiers. I'm just going to minimize my subsurface modifier for a moment, and then I'm going to add a displace modifier. This is going to be the finer details. I'm going to set the direction to Z, so the displacements will only go up and down. I'm going to say new, and we'll call this texture small. Texture coordinates will say UV, and we'll select our UV map. I'm going to set the strength to 0.1, and I think I set the mid-level to 0.6, but that will vary a lot. And then we press this little control here, and click here, and I'm going to select distorted noise. I kept Blender Original for the top one, and the bottom one I selected Voronoi F2. 0.01 for distortion and 0.01 for size. That's added a little bit of fine detail. If I now come back to the modifier, you can see if I turn it on and off, there's a subtle variation in shading. So let's minimize that one and add another one. So it's another displacement modifier. Again in the Z direction. This time I used local, so I'm not going to bother changing that one at the moment. And I'll say new, and we'll call this one texture large. The strength I set to 0.5, and again the mid-level was 0.6. Click this little control, and this time I used clouds. I set the clouds to hard, which just gives you a harsher switch between bright and dark. Stuck with Blender Original, 0.25 for the size, and the rest as default. So if we come back to our modifiers, If I put this up to 4, this basically adds more vertices, which allows Blender to start to make more use of these displacement modifiers, or the detail from these displacement modifiers. And we can even go higher. So I've gone up to 5 there, and you can see there is a lot more detail. But I'm going to go this goes down to 3 for the moment, just so that we've got a bit of memory and what have you left for Blender to show us what's going on. So I'm going to go back to the camera view and have a look. So it's not quite as I would want it. We can play around with some of these values here. And you'll often get this slight problem here, and typically that's because vertices have stretched too far during the distort modifier, and so often ramping back on the strength will help, but so too will increasing the number of vertices. But of course that can cause other problems as well. So that preview is only being done at 3, so we'll go with a render and see what that gives us. I've just got this set to 25 samples, and we'll give this a quick render to see what we get. So it's not too bad. It still needs some tweaking, and this is the thing with these sorts of scenes. You do need to keep testing and tweaking things. I would say the color's not quite right. I need to adjust the camera slightly, and we need to adjust the position of the light slightly as well. So if we have a look at the preview and we rotate the sun around, we can start to look for a better angle for the light. So I'm just going to look from above over here while I watch this here. I'm just rotating. And you can see when the light starts to come around, we get a lot more light reflected. And it will, of course, vary with each scene, with each model, exactly what the best angle, depending on what you're trying to achieve, is. I quite like this sort of angle because it gives you that contrast between light bouncing straight off the surface and light passing through it. So that's not too bad, though there's a lot of darkness there as well. So perhaps we need to rotate our iceberg a bit, and then maybe view the sun from the front and make it effectively higher in the sky. And we can increase the number of subdivisions for the iceberg as well. That's starting to look about right now. So one last quick thing, and that is I put some broken pieces of ice on the surface of the water because that seemed to be quite a common theme. So I'll come to a new layer and we'll add an icosphere just with one subdivision, scale it on the X a little bit and just distort it somewhat. They're not going to be too visible. There are, of course, lots of different ways to create random particles like this. So I'm now going to go to Material, just say New, and we'll copy the ice material to begin with. And then I'll just click this button here to create a new version of it. Let's call it Parts. I forgot to name it previously. Select all of these, select that one and say Copy Material to Others. And now I need to just make a slight change to it. So I'm going to move my sun to the layer with C in it, and I'm just going to put my particles, make them a bit bigger so they're easier to see, somewhere around the middle of the scene so that I can see them rendered. So the issue I have is that they're very transparent at that size. As you can see, we can see straight through them. So we could have a completely different material, or I have created it as a unique material. We can just play around with how they work. So I don't think we really need the volumetric for these, and that removes a little bit of calculation that Blender needs to do. And then we can just play around with this, and in fact we don't even need that transparent now, so I'm just going to take that straight in there and get rid of all of that. Make sure we've got a good roughness on it, and we'll set these to smooth shading as well. So that will do for now. Come over to here, select each one, Control G, and that will automatically form a group. We won't even bother changing the name. Come back to the C, and we'll add a particle system. Call the first one large. Need to name it twice. We'll stick with 1,000 particles. Lifetime doesn't matter if we're just rendering one frame, but we'll make sure the start and end is 1. I went with faces, not that it matters that much because we've only got one face, and random, but I did select use modifier stack, not that that matters too much. Come back to your particles if you've got an orientation like I have where they're relatively flat, and rotate on the y-axis 90. This is just a funny of the particle system. If you want the particles to appear in the expected rotation, that's what you need to do. Once you've selected all of this, click rotation. I put a little bit of randomness on the rotation. I put the phase up to full and the random phase up to full as well. Physics I set to no. And then under here I select group and my particle group, select rotation and select pick random. Random size up at maximum. Actual size I set to 0.15. And we'll see how that looks. This is the large particles. I'll bring my iceberg up so you can see these are very large. They're large enough to see. So I now need to come back to my particle system, say plus, copy the same particle system, but click the little 2 so it's unique. We'll call this small particles. This one I had 10,000 particles. Everything else the same except the size I set to 0.04. So they're much smaller particles. So this way you can say I want an awful lot of the smaller particles and a few of the larger. Whereas if I set the size just stuck with the size at 0.15 and put 10,000 in, it would be a relatively even distribution between the very large particles and the very small particles and everything in between. This way I can just have a few large particles and everything else is smaller than a certain size, which manages the amount of render work that's got to go on. So let's give that a quick render. I'll render it at 50% because there's one last little thing that I did. Okay, so I've brought down a new window and we'll go to the node editor again. And we'll come into here and say use nodes. So there's the output of our scene, and that's the composite output. First of all, I'm going to add a gamma node and just drop that there. I should say I am using filmic encoding on base contrast. And in fact, before we go any further, I'm going to change that because I use medium to high contrast. You can see that sort of just enhanced the scene a little bit, but the rest I stuck with the defaults. So I'm just going to go up one click on the gamma, which you see again sort of increases the contrast of the scene and deepens the color. So now I'm going to add color balance node and drop that there. And we're told we shouldn't use lift gamma gain, we should use offset and power for more accurate mapping of colors. And I just set slope to just a slightly yellowy reddish color and left power and offset where they were, just to give me that again slight blue cast to the scene. Next I'm going to add an ellipse mask, and I'll just drop that in there for the moment so that you can see the mask, and adjust its width to be just slightly less than the image, and the same with the height. Might need to change that again when I go back to 100%. I set this to not, so it's just black. I'll just put this back again, drag my ellipse mask down here, add filter, which is a blur node, and put the ellipse mask through that, set it to fast Gaussian, relative, and I set it to 25%. Move those down a little bit. And I'm going to add a color mix node and just drop that there. The other side of my blur node goes into there. There's my blurred vignette. I'm going to set this to 0.49. You can see my scene starting to come through there, and then set it to multiply. So you can see all it's doing really is lightening the center a little bit and darkening the edges a little bit. It's just that slight vignette that you get from a real camera. There's one last little bit to do, and that is I wanted a little bit of, sort of to simulate a little bit of fog or ice crystals in the air without really putting volumetric shading throughout the whole scene. So I added a filter which is a glare node, drop that in there, and you can see by default you get these streaks. I set it to fog glow, left it on medium, put the threshold at 0.5, and then we can play around. We've got quite a bright spot on this scene actually, just there. So it's actually having quite a significant effect. And I'm going to make that a little smaller. They're just basically a couple of fireflies that are in there that are really showing up. So if I do one more render, this time at 100%, roughly speaking, there it is. Now, like I said, this isn't a photorealistic render. It was never intended to be, but you can play around with some of the settings to see how the scene works for you. Certainly playing around with these color balance settings will give you some different options in terms of color, and you will also want to play around with the settings for the modifiers, as that will give you a lot of variation in the way this works. So you can see the one I did, I put quite a bit more glare on it. I emphasized how dark and green the sea was a little bit. So even though I've used exactly the same settings, you saw how different that looked. And that's down to exactly how big your scene is, exactly where things are. So you can play around with those settings to try and get the look that you want. This is not by any means a photorealistic representation of an iceberg, but I think it's quite a nice sort of painterly look for it. And obviously the color balance of the scene will affect the general look of the scene as well. I think the fog glow really adds that slight misty, icy air look, and there's even a little bit of pinkness coming through from the particular shade I used for the volume scatter. And essentially that's the big secret here, is using volume scatter as a sort of subsurface scattering. And you might want to try subsurface scattering, but I found this seemed to work better for me. So I'll see you in the next tutorial. Thanks a lot. So I hope you found that interesting. If you did, let me know. If you enjoy these tutorials, don't forget to click like and subscribe. I also have a Facebook page and a Twitter account, and I now have a Patreon page as well. And I'll provide links to all of those in the description below. So I'll see you in the next tutorial. Thanks a lot.